If you've ever played Warcraft, then you probably understand without even realizing it the main principles, the most basic principles of world geopolitics, power dynamics, and how empires or even civilizations are built and grown.
My lord? Okay, hello. Righto. Hello. Alright. Alright. My lord? Yes, my lord. Okay. Hello. Alright.
You're in contact. You're what do you recommend? Move out.
What is it? Very well, you need assistance? Alright. As you wish.
Welcome to this new video where we will carry on our lecture about Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of the Humankind. In the previous video, we laid out the main ideas and things to remember about the cognitive revolution, and today we will tackle the agricultural revolution. So when you're playing Warcraft, it all basically comes down to a few simple things in the beginning, at least, in order to achieve your mission, defeating the enemy or conquering the whole map of the world or whatever. So the things it all comes down to in the beginning are extracting natural resources to create quantified and exploitable resource, such as gold, timber, iron, food, etc., etc. And the second thing is building the means to maintain these resources and grow them, and most importantly, restore them when they've been under attack from external forces, may they be human or environmental. Okay? So this implies making decisions and enforcing them on a collective level. And we already saw in the previous video with the cognitive revolution how people are brought and gathered to adhere to a certain notion or idea.
Or the Alliance.
In the previous video, we already went over how all of this became possible, if you remember, with the cognitive revolution. The social fabric of human organization was able to grow through and thanks to more increasingly sophisticated means of communication, right? From gossip at a fairly small scale to military tactics and so on, thanks to common beliefs and stories. We saw that fiction is the core of every dense and complex social system. Now keep in mind here that when we say fiction, we mean it in the terms defined by Yuval Noah Harari in his book, where fiction for him is more of a social construct, if you will, or an imagined reality. For example, Libya is a fiction, France is a fiction, the nation is a fiction, God is a fiction, money is a fiction, human rights, justice are fictions, right? Because they have no biological reality, okay? So moving on. So in Warcraft, coming back to Warcraft, you are the story. You command with clicks, and you face circumstances that are both the results of your actions and of an adverse algorithm working against you, working to challenge you, okay? Because it's still a game. It's designed to be a game to be entertaining. So you start sending out your peasants to chop wood, right? Then they build barracks for your growing armies, and so on and so on. And as you expand your cities, the shadows of the unknown part of your universe in Warcraft lift themselves, right? They give way to your expansion, the shadows. And that shadow here represents the limit, the frontier to your civilization. If you remember what we said about the Western frontier when we talked about the history of the USA, okay? It's basically the same notion here. If you're playing Warcraft, you're going to have to unveil pixel by pixel, if I may say so, every part of the universe you're evolving in, okay? And if you're on multiplayer mode, you are going to have to build alliances, probably, with others to secure the achievement of your goals, whatever they may be. And this achievement is based on the soundness of your strategy and on your commands. But because Warcraft is designed to function under a certain algorithm, because it's still a game, it is highly unlikely that if you command one of your peasants or one of your soldiers or any one of your pawns on your chessboard, they're going to say, no.
No, I don't really feel like
Hurry, bro, I don't even know you. What are you talking about? No idea. Leave me alone. They're not going to react this way. Because these pawns on your chessboard are at your command.
Your command.
And they do not have any personal free will, right? They're algorithms. So the outcome of your mission depends entirely on your sole decision making, and your peasants and soldiers and pawns are like bees or ants. They obey you because they are genetically determined or algorithmically determined or programmed to behave in a certain way. But our reality is a bit more complex than this algorithm that enables Warcraft to function as a game. What made humans a particular species sitting atop the animal realm was our genetic flexibility, right? If you remember. Or our deep learning kind of internal programming, in addition to our high cooperation skills in large numbers. When we have a common story, we can all base ourselves on. But let's leave our Warcraft analogy for a moment and resume with our reading of Harari's Sapiens. So after covering the cognitive revolution, he goes on to talk about the agricultural revolution, which really started to speed up, according to him, 12,000 years ago. And this is when many large societies became sedentary. They stopped moving around. We went from being foragers, hunter-gatherers, to cultivators, sedentary cultivators. Here's a short paragraph. He says, Sapiens began to devote almost all their time and effort to manipulating the lives of a few animal and plant species. From sunrise to sunset, humans sowed seeds, watered plants, plucked weeds from the ground, and led sheep to prime pastures. This work, they thought, would provide them with more fruit, grain, and meat. It was a revolution. It was a revolution in the ways humans lived. The agricultural revolution. So what Harari really thoroughly explains in his book is how the acquisition of agriculture techniques completely transformed Sapiens' approach to survival and social order. As Sapiens started to own land and exploit it to produce its food and wealth, the survival of Sapiens relied more and more on planning ahead. Later on, the first kingdoms and empires emerged, and this agricultural revolution is irreversible. Sapiens can never go back to the way of life it was upholding before it happened, because agriculture really shaped how we genetically evolved and adapted to our environments later on. And in addition to this aspect, there's also the fact that agriculture is an activity that involves many social and political aspects, and it really, the way a society, civilization is organized, it's always around this activity that is agriculture, okay? So it really set the foundations of a new kind of social order. And as Sapiens opted for a sedentary lifestyle, it turned away, according to Harari, it turned away from a whole potential portion of its algorithm. All right. Harari ponders what could have been possible, the potential directions our species could have taken had it not settled for agriculture. So he claims this revolution was a trap, a fraud even. He goes as far as to say that its benefits for humankind, as told by some scholars, are a fantastic tale. He says, scholars once proclaimed that the agricultural revolution was a great leap forward for humanity. They told a tale of progress fueled by human brain power. Evolution gradually produced ever more intelligent people. Eventually, people were so smart that they were able to decipher nature's secrets, enabling them to tame sheep and cultivate wheat. As soon as this happened, they cheerfully abandoned the grueling, dangerous, and often Spartan life of hunter-gatherers, settling down to enjoy the pleasant, satiated life of farmers. As we've said, Harari seems to think another scenario would have been possible for maybe the direction of humankind's progression had it not gone all in with this agricultural revolution. He says further in the book, there is no evidence that people became more intelligent with time. Foragers knew the secrets of nature long before the agricultural revolution, since their survival depended on an intimate knowledge of the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. Rather than heralding a new era of easy living, the agricultural revolution left farmers with lives generally more difficult and less satisfying than those of foragers. Hunter-gatherers spent their time in more stimulating and varied ways, and were less in danger of starvation and disease. The agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum total of food at the disposal of humankind, but the extra food did not translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translated into population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud. So what he means here is that hunter-gatherers had a more cognitive, conscious use of their cognitive functions, of their memories, of their perceptions. They led a life that was more stimulating, of course, that was not so full of material possessions because they are harder to carry around. But when we settled into large cities revolving around agriculture and production factors, well, we kind of got fooled. We got scammed by history, basically, because it seems more comfortable, an easier lifestyle, but for most people, and especially for cultivators and farmers, it was a very difficult living. It was exhausting. It was working sunrise to sunset to the detriment of their health. Contrary to common beliefs, Harari holds that agriculture actually made life harder for Sapiens instead of bringing him comfortable lifestyles. And he further asks, that's another quote, who was responsible? Neither kings, nor priests, nor merchants. The culprits were a handful of plant species, including wheat, rice, and potatoes. These plants domesticated Homo sapiens rather than vice versa. If you think about it, that's a very interesting way to look at this. Harari gives an example of how we think we domesticated wheat, but it's actually wheat that domesticated us. If you want to know more in detail why he thinks this and where he develops this argument, read the book. I will give you the link. So Harari really lays out 3 levels on which we can see how this revolution impacted in a negative way the progress of humankind, the well-being of sapiens, if you prefer. Genetically first, showing that the human body was genetically determined to feed on a variety of foods and to receive certain stimuli and to be active daily, performing different actions such as running, jumping, climbing, etc., etc. But with the agricultural revolution, grains and cereals, as we said, became the bulk of sapiens' calorie intake. Then the second reason that Harari claims was a negative impact for humans, for sapiens, is that he sees that, quote, foragers relied on dozens of species to survive and could therefore weather difficult years even without stocks or preserved food. If the availability of one species was reduced, they could gather and hunt more of other species. Farming societies have, until very recently, relied for the great bulk of their calorie intake on a small variety of domesticated plants. In many areas, they relied on just a single staple, such as wheat, potatoes, or rice. If the rains failed or clouds of locusts arrived, or if a fungus learned how to infect that stable species, peasants died by thousands and millions. The agricultural revolution made sapiens more vulnerable to environmental external factors such as the weather, etc., etc. Harari carries on, he writes, nor could wheat offer security against human violence. The early farmers were at least as violent as their forager ancestors, if not more so. Farmers had more possessions and needed land for planting. The loss of pasture land to raiding neighbors could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation, so there was much less room for compromise. When a foraging band was hard-pressed by a stronger rival, it could usually move on. It was difficult and dangerous, but it was feasible. When a strong enemy threatened an agricultural village, retreat meant giving up fields, houses, and granaries. In many cases, this doomed the refugees to starvation. Farmers, therefore, tended to stay put and fight to the bitter end. End quote. Lastly, third reason why agricultural was a negative thing for humans, according to Harari, is that agricultural revolution brought hostility among humans with more disastrous consequences. Sedentary lifestyle implies accumulating possessions, and hoarding possessions imply coveting and envy, and therefore violence. So another quote, because I love quotes, let's be honest. The first part of the plan went smoothly. People indeed worked harder, but people did not foresee that the number of children would increase, meaning that the extra wheat would have to be shared between more children. Neither did the early farmers understand that feeding children with more porridge and less breast milk would weaken their immune system, and that permanent settlements would be hotbeds for infectious diseases. They did not foresee that by increasing their dependence on a single source of food, they were actually exposing themselves even more to the depredation of drought. Nor did the farmers foresee that in good years their bulging granaries would tempt thieves and enemies, compelling them to start building walls and doing guard duty. End quote. And that, in my opinion, beautifully sums up how and why historians have called some periods of antiquity, of ancient history, Bronze Age and Iron Age. So this whole agricultural process necessarily implied labor, as we've said, weapons, warfare, And that's why a sociologic lens on this human revolution is important to keep when we're thinking about progress, especially during the agricultural revolution period. So to produce and maintain these advances, humans had to work and fight harder and harder over time. Moving on with the next quote. Then why didn't humans abandon farming when the plan backfired? Partly because it took generations for the small changes to accumulate and transform society, and by then, nobody remembered that they had ever lived differently. So with all these quotes, and there are more to come, we've seen that the agricultural revolution transformed completely the way humans organize themselves. And actually, Harari's hypothesis on this phenomenon was that this occurred with the beginning of some forms of religion or religious rituals, with the edification of temples. When they build a statue or an idol or a temple or a place of worship, basically, humans had to stay close to this temple to keep performing their worship, and thus started to settle and grow, and then to feed the growing population started cultivating and settling in this area. So these cognitive and agricultural revolutions were shifts that were irreversible, as we've seen, and this was, again, all enabled by fictions that helped people gather and accept a new social order. Agriculture, instead of spurring millennia of growth and prosperous wealth, arguably, at least according to Harari, made survival harder and less rewarding for some humans, for most humans. And as we've seen, Harari goes as far as calling this revolution a fraud, a trap, or a fantastic tale. So let's come back to the most powerful fiction now for the last part of this video. I mean, the most important fictitious reality or figment of Sapiens' imagination, to use Harari's terms, that has been the most powerful in all of history. Of course, I mean money or currency. So further, Harari writes about money that empires generate huge amounts of information. Beyond laws, empires have to keep accounts or transactions and taxes, inventories of military supplies and merchant vessels, and calendars of festivals and victories. For millions of years, people stored information in a single place, their brains. Unfortunately, the human brain is not a good storage device for empire-sized databases, for three main reasons. And the reasons he gives are limitation of brain functions and abilities, limited memory capacity of the human brain, its mortality, and its adaptability to needs and environments, basically. Because the brain memory functions have adapted to this new sedentary lifestyle around an empire or a kingdom or a very large city, with activities such as agriculture, with the emergence of currencies, of money, of wealth. Of course, all of this data overloads the capacity of the human brain. So with this, new memory supports are created, like tablets, the language of numbers, basically, to keep count. And to process this data, we see the birth of what we call, my friends, bureaucracy. So he says, ancient scribes learned not merely to read and write, but also to use catalogs, dictionaries, calendars, forms, and tables. They studied and internalized techniques of cataloging, retrieving, and processing information very different from those used by the brain. In the brain, all data is freely associated, unlike in bureaucracy, of course, which is based on separation of information. He writes further down, Harari, that dollars have value only in our common imagination, right? We already know this, like social construct, basically. So their worth is not inherent in the chemical structure of the paper, or their color, or their shape. In other words, money isn't a material reality. It is a psychological construct. It works by converting matter into mind. But why does it succeed? Why should anyone be willing to exchange a fertile rice paddy for a handful of useless pieces of paper? Why are you willing to flip hamburgers, sell health insurance, or babysit 3 obnoxious brats, when all you get for your exertions is a few pieces of colored paper? People are willing to do such things when they trust the figments of their collective imagination. Trust is the raw material from which all types of money are minted. When a wealthy farmer sold his possessions for a sack of cowrie shells back in the days and traveled with them to another province, he trusted that upon reaching his destination, other people would be willing to sell him rice, houses, and fields in exchange for the shells. Money is accordingly a system of mutual trust, and not just any system of mutual trust. Money is the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. Okay, a couple paragraphs more before we conclude this video. Commerce, empires, and universal religions eventually brought virtually every sapiens on every continent into the global world we live in today. Not that this process of expansion and unification was linear or without interruptions. Looking at the bigger picture, though, the transition from many small cultures to a few large cultures, and finally to a single global society, was probably an inevitable result of the dynamics of human history. But saying that a global society is inevitable is not the same as saying that the end result had to be the particular kind of global society we now have. We can certainly imagine other outcomes. Why is English so widespread today and not Danish? Why are there about 2 billion Christians and 1.25 billion Muslims, but only 150,000 Zoroastrians and no Manichaeans? If we could go back in time to 10,000 years ago and set the process going again, time after time, would we always see the rise of monotheism and the decline of dualism? All right, I will let you ponder this. And to conclude, just a quick recap of everything we've seen and said in this video that is important to remember is that the agricultural revolution sped up 12,000 years ago, and with it came the acquisition of new techniques. It led to a new approach for humans to survival and social order based on planning ahead and labor and cooperation. The agricultural revolution was irreversible and gave way to the edification of kingdoms and empires. It brought more security and comfort, although that is arguable, but what is certain is that it decreased sapiens' need to use certain physical and cognitive abilities and skills. It led to a less varied diet, more famine, and malnutrition. With the agricultural revolution, humanity changed completely its approach to social order, labor, and employment became part of the social hierarchy. To maintain such an order, the processing of data had to keep up with the growth of the populations. Languages became more sophisticated, and the language of numbers became essential.